is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
It is 3 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we are, I think, duty-bound to wade straight into the consequences of events in Parliament yesterday. And I've got a new theory. Do you want to hear it? I've got a theory. And it is obviously a timely opportunity to reflect upon the state of the nation. But I think about media a lot, you know I do, and it's a habit I have to break a bit, because the public's relationship with media, particularly young people's, bears no resemblance whatsoever to mine or to older people's. And in fact, there is a story in the news today about how the very definition of being old is changing before our very eyes. We may have a little look at that later if we feel the need for a quick paddle in the shallower end of current affairs. But the relationship with media, I just find myself wondering about how many different countries we live in. You know, how many people are getting their information from TikTok, for example, or from a YouTube-shaped rabbit hole where everything from sort of anti-vaccine rhetoric right through to New World Order and demonization of the World Economic Forum seems to have taken a hold on some previously quite sensible people. But the reason I mention it today is because I don't know whether or not most people who rely upon traditional media are going to get a full picture of what a mess this country is in until there's a Labour government. I was thinking about it with regard, dare I say, to a couple of colleagues here at LBC who have, over the last few years, encouraged you to vote for Brexit, to vote for Boris Johnson. Some of them remain warm even towards Liz Truss. And I thought about that in the context of the broader media landscape, where, of course, such attitudes are almost de rigueur. They're almost requirements to work for the Daily Mail or the Daily Express or the Daily Telegraph or the Sun, and up to a certain point the Times, but not as completely as those other organs. And all of these outlets have essentially shilled for the Tories since 2010. They told you austerity would be a good idea. They told you George Osborne was a genius. They told you Boris Johnson was a man more sinned against than sinning. They told you Brexit would make you richer. They told you warnings about food or pharmaceutical supplies were just part of Project Fear. They're telling you now that Liz Truss wasn't responsible for your mortgage going up. Well, some of them are. So how are you ever going to get a clear picture of the state of the nation when the people responsible for installing the people in power for a decade and a half are also in charge of the flow of information? David's been in touch to say there's quite a lot of you on TikTok, by the way. So obviously I would like to remove the suggestion that TikTok is not a reliable source of current affairs coverage, if indeed it is my little clips that you are tuning into. 6 minutes after 10 is the time. So that's my new theory. You're welcome to pass it off as your own in polite company, but I think it is yet another reason why I kind of almost admire the fact that Keir Starmer still wants to be Prime Minister. He's clearly not embarked upon a mad personal psychodrama like Kemi Badenoch or even perhaps Jeremy Hunt, but certainly Grant Shapps or whatever name he's going by this week. He doesn't want to be Prime Minister simply like Boris Johnson so he can spend the rest of his life with it on a business card that sticks a 0 on the end of all his speaking engagements. He wants to be. I wouldn't want to be Prime Minister at this point in British history for all the tea in Yorkshire. I really wouldn't. Just think, I mean, where do you even start? Yesterday it was the police, today it's prisons. Immigration, of course, has been simultaneously turned into a mad issue in this country, almost completely unhitched from any semblance of observable reality. Our economy is facing all manner of attacks. Goldman Sachs, where Rishi Sunak used to work, estimates about a 5% hit to our GDP as a direct consequence of the Brexit that Rishi Sunak still pretends was a good idea. Just think about that single nugget for a minute. Just that single nugget right there. When Rishi Sunak was a Goldman Sachs analyst, he would rely on Goldman Sachs research to decide where to place his bets, for want of a better word. He would rely on Goldman Sachs research, so in-house, self-propelled Goldman Sachs research by Goldman Sachs analysts, of which he was one, to make his decisions about where to move money and financial planning, as it were, and profit making. He would rely on precisely that sort of research. And the latest research out of that merchant bank says that Brexit has hit our GDP by 5%, not 5% of GDP. And he has to completely ignore it. So Rishi Sunak is a man who has to completely ignore the kind of research and detail that his entire career as a financier would once have been built on. I love that example of how mad things are, because it bites, doesn't it? You've not thought of it that way round before. This is all in the book, by the way. Paperback's out on Thursday. It's all in How They Broke Britain. But you've not thought of it that way. Right? Hang on a minute. I can understand why some Herbert from the Institute of Economic Affairs or, a single-digit IQ merchant like Liz Truss, I can understand why they want to poo-poo Goldman Sachs. I can understand why a sort of flatulent, fibbity-gibbet like Nigel Farage wants to poo-poo. He poo-poos everything. But a bloke that worked at Goldman Sachs somehow ending up in a place where he has to ignore precisely the sort of research that he used to rely on to do his job at Goldman Sachs. That's a moment of madness that doesn't get properly reflected because the flow of information to the public is largely in the control of the people that are still telling you that Rishi Sunak is a stand-up guy, that Liz Truss would be a good Prime Minister, that Boris Johnson was trustworthy and honourable, that austerity was necessary, that the bankers weren't responsible for the financial crash of 2008. Rather, it was the proliferation of Sure Start schemes, or, to paraphrase Alexei Sayle, the fact that there were too many libraries in Wolverhampton. We will not know, or rather you will not know, unless I suppose you buy my book, you will not know just how bad this country has been treated, just how damaged we have become, until Labour are in power and all the right-wing client media can start describing it accurately, because they'll be able to either implicitly or explicitly pretend that it's all the fault of the Labour government. Quite timely, really, that today is St. George's Day. Is Happy St. George's Day a thing? I like it. I think it should be. Keir Starmer's put out a nice little clip today trying to distill British values, reclaim some of the paraphernalia of English nationalism from the sort of racist and National Front flavoured caucuses and corners of the country. Good luck to him with that. But it's another example of how steep the mountain is that he's going to have to climb. Which brings us up to today. And the decision yesterday, or the forcing through yesterday of legislation in Parliament that does many, many things to our standing on the international stage. It undermines the role that the judges play. It undermines the role that the judiciary plays in scrutinising legislation. It removes entirely judicial scrutiny from the core issue of whether or not Rwanda is a safe country. Described by David Anderson, King's Counsel, in no uncertain terms. Lord Anderson of Ipswich, as he is now, described as a legal fiction that makes the law look like an ass and those who make it asses. He is a crossbench peer, and therefore yet more evidence that James Cleverly's repeated claim that the legislation was being scuppered by Labour lords is a mathematical and indeed an intellectual and, to boot, a moral nonsense. We are concerned over the safety of Rwanda, both in the present and in the future. This bill, he said yesterday, is honest about neither. He describes a disregard for our international commitments. He describes the avoidance of statutory protections for the vulnerable. And he concludes quite correctly that the benefits of the bill remain to be seen. Its costs will be measured not only in money, but in principles debased. Incredibly powerful speech, not the only incredibly powerful speech in the House of Lords yesterday from people still trying to, if you like, stem the decline, pause the collapse. He is a visiting professor of law at King's College and a former UK independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, so he knows a little bit about what he's talking about. And we don't, do we? We don't really know what we're talking about. Did you know, for example, that the Rwandan scheme is currently believed to be able to cope with 200 people a year? That's the analysis of the deals that have been signed. There are two things about that figure that are immediately arresting. The first is that it is completely at odds with what Rishi Sunak claimed yesterday about a regular rhythm of deportations. You're deporting them to a place that is currently capable of receiving 200. That wouldn't be one charter flight full, would it? And what percentage of the number of people that arrived by small boat in 2023 do you think 200 is? Can you work that? Can anyone else work? Well, you need to know off the top of your head how many people arrived here by small boat in 2023. Who's got that kind of figure at their fingertips? I don't. I know what the percentage is. So you would need to know what that figure is, the overall figure of people that came here in 2023, and then what percentage 200 would be of that figure. I can tell you the second bit. 0.7% of the number of people who came here in 2023 alone would be accommodated by the Rwanda scheme in its current form with a capability of taking 200 people. And that's in the proposed facility, which there is some confusion over how much of it has subsequently been sold to Rwandan citizens. The other figure that perhaps you're not fully aware of is that the enforced removals of rejected asylum seekers since the Tories came to power in 2010 are down by 73%. I don't care how big your heart is or how deep your well of human kindness, if somebody is properly assessed and found not to have a valid claim for asylum, it is reasonable to say to them, sorry, pal, but on your bike. It is reasonable to say that. And we have said that 73% less since 2010, when the Tories came to power, the party that somehow still manages to portray itself as being the sworn enemy of asylum claims, of refugees and of immigration in general, even, of course, as the overall figures absolutely rocket. So every single person who arrives by small boat under legislation forced through by the Tories becomes described as an illegal, even if they're from Afghanistan. If they arrive by small boat, even if they were working for the British security services in Syria or undercover with ISIS in Iraq, or even if they were helping translate for the British military in Afghanistan, they become, by definition, illegal and therefore susceptible to deportation to Rwanda, a country where refugees not long ago were shot dead by the authorities for complaining about their food rations. A country where critics of Paul Kagame can be kidnapped and jailed. Indeed, we spoke to the daughters of such a man not long ago on this programme. But none of that matters now because we've signed up for it. We've signed up for it, and once again, elements, although I don't think a majority, but elements of the British public have been persuaded that they are in favour of the removal of their own rights and freedoms. Because remember, if they can do it to a refugee today, they can do it to you tomorrow. In fact, there is a quote, a very telling quote from the late Tony Benn, a politician who was interesting in many, many ways, far from infallible, far from perfect, but on matters of human dignity, he was often very apposite, often very appropriate. The way a government, he once said, treats refugees is very instructive because it shows you how they would treat the rest of us if they thought they could get away with it. I think that merits repetition. The way a government treats refugees is very instructive because it shows you how they would treat the rest of us if they thought they could get away with it. So what's the question today? Well, it's an odd one, actually, and it's inspired in part by the last call that we took yesterday from Alex, who is an asylum seeker and who has been unable to have his application processed, because another thing we don't fully understand is that the change in the law under the immigration bill means that you cannot be a successful asylum applicant if you came here via an unsafe route, and there are no safe routes, except for Hong Kong nationals and some Afghans. There are no safe routes for anybody else. This is the madness that I try to articulate to you almost every day. That they've made it illegal to come here via the unsafe routes, so anybody who comes via an unsafe route is automatically classed as an illegal alien, but there are no safe routes. So every single person that's here now is, as of this morning, susceptible to deportation to Rwanda, which currently has the capacity to take 200 people. That's the madness of the situation that we're in. The absolute madness of it. And this is government policy. This isn't some sort of, fascist flibberty-gibbet sniping from the sidelines, making unkeepable promises in order to distract or embarrass the people in power. And that is traditionally what far-right parties do. They tell lies about foreigners. They make ludicrous claims. They promise that they'll be able to fix it. Just don't ask us how. This is now government policy. Utterly, morally bereft and statistically nonsensical. But it's government policy. So, 90 minutes after 10, how will we know? I mean, I can't even ask you that. How will we know whether it's worked? I don't know who the policy is appealing to. I don't know who the policy is appealing to. I really don't anymore. I don't, because even the people that are selling it, from Rishi Sunak and James Cleverly down, and of course Andrew Mitchell, the Deputy Foreign Secretary, who had the job yesterday of selling it in studios, they have all gone on the record, actually, in Mitchell's case, and widely believed to have gone off the record in the case of Sunak and Cleverly in condemnation of this plan. And yet it's government policy. So I have got a question for you, and it is inspired in part by Alex's call yesterday, a genuine asylum seeker, or at least a genuine asylum seeker. But of course, you don't become a genuine recipient of asylum until your application has been processed. But if you came here by a small boat, it's never going to be processed in this country. I want to know whether or not it will be a deterrent. That's all. And I think to answer that question, you might need to know a little bit about the process of coming here, or indeed to be someone who has come here, seeking asylum, ideally, or perhaps just seeking a new life more broadly. But it is simultaneously a safe and lovely place to which we can happily deport hundreds of people who may well be genuine refugees. That will be decided when they get there. And at the same time, it is such an awful destination that it is going to deter people from crossing the channel to come here. I don't know if that's an oxymoron. Is that an oxymoron? It is simultaneously so lovely that we have rewritten the meaning of the word unsafe to mean safe, but also so awful that it will put people off trying to come to Britain. And that's my question for you. The French Coast Guard confirmed this morning that 5 people have died attempting to cross the channel. That's 3 men, a woman and a child. Stop for a minute, please, and think about that. What do you think those deaths are in the minds of the people still in Calais? I hate to use such a clinical word in this context, but every one of those deaths is a deterrent. That dead baby, that dead child, I'm sorry, I don't know their age, that dead child is a deterrent. The 110 people in that small boat that set sail from a beach in Germany, or a commune in France, sorry, I'm a little unclear on the nomenclature. But the 110 people who set sail this morning in that small boat knew that death was a possibility. The possibility of death was a deterrent. But they tell us today, and it didn't work. They still came. But they tell us today that the possibility of deportation to Rwanda will somehow work where death does not. And that's why I want you to tell me how it will work as a deterrent, whether it will work as a deterrent. If you think it will work as a deterrent, 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Will it work as a deterrent to the kind of people who died in the Channel this morning? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is madder than even I appreciated. I've told you before, when I start laying it out for you, I start trying to package it up in easily digestible portions. Sometimes I choke on it. It's absolute madness. A scheme that would only address 0.7% of the people that came here last year alone is somehow going to be so effective that all the people planning on coming this year or next year are suddenly going to change their minds. I could be wrong, but you need to explain to me how you think it will work as a deterrent. When Simon has been in touch already to say, I'm a journalist working in Tunisia. We regularly talk with people who have crossed the desert, spent time in Libyan prisons and lost family members trying to get to Europe. The 1 in 1,000 chance of being deported, if most people even knew about it, wouldn't even give them pause. And this morning, the greatest deterrent of all, unfolding in the English Channel, where 5 human beings died this morning. 3 men, a woman and a child, probably a fighting age child. That's the language, isn't it? You're supposed to deploy. They died. They knew that they could die. They knew that they might die. They knew that people who had gone before them had died. And still they got in the boat. So tell me what deterrent means in the context of being deported to a place that Suella Braverman says she would happily visit on holiday. Omar's in Gloucester. Omar, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning, James. It's first time calling here.
Welcome.
I know you're going to say it's only me again.
Well, no, you haven't said you're nervous yet.
Well, I'm trying to control it as much as I could.
Well, it's only
However, being a migrant myself, James, this it's I'll equate it to a business person. It's either taking the risk.
Yes.
And
I think we've lost him. I think something went wrong to your phone line there. I'm not sure what. Go back to taking the risk, and we'll see if the phone line will hold.
Yeah, it's taking the risk, just like a business person, or die in poverty. That's the two. So you can say yes, you're going to do that, and it's going to deter everyone from coming. No, it's not going to do that. You sit back and be poor for life.
That is almost impossible, I think, for people who benefit from what I would call Western privilege to fully compute. Actually, I mean the idea of a life that is so denuded and deprived that you actually think it's worth risking losing life altogether in pursuit of the relatively scant comfort, by the standards of people who were born here, that being an asylum seeker or a migrant in the UK can bring.
That is correct. Unfortunately, our Prime Minister is privileged with a silver spoon.
Yeah,
he doesn't understand the other side. Like
I'm not sure I fully understand it either. You know, if in my heart of hearts I can't quite. I've got empathy, but I can't quite imagine being stuck in. Where can I ask where you're from originally?
Gambia.
I'm stuck in Gambia, and I'm weighing up my options, and I'm looking at the road ahead. And I'm thinking, do you know what? I'm going to risk death rather than stay here.
That's correct. Simple as that.
So deportation to Rwanda doesn't even touch the sides, does it?
No, it's not. Other than that, the people from Afghanistan as well. Mm. The people that risk their life, people that were working in our armed forces. Unfortunately, we're going to get most of them because they came through the boats as well. I knew people personally in my life that came through the boats. And
from Afghanistan. I think it's reported today that 20% of the new arrivals are from Vietnam. So that terrible embellishment about Albanians that the Farage party was responsible for still being disproved on a daily basis. But can I ask you something a little more complicated? So Paul's been in touch, and I don't know that he's heading for Idiot's Corner yet, but he makes a point that some people still make. Oh, he writes, France is such a terrible country. You can see why any responsible parent would sail across the channel to escape with their kids from the tyranny of the French regime. Because I can understand how fleeing poverty in Gambia might become a life-risking gambit, but fleeing a camp in Calais or fleeing France, that final step of the journey. And I appreciate that it involves an abandonment of our international obligations and that France already does more per capita than we do. But that question of, line's gone down again. We'll try and get him back up. after the news. At the time now is 10:31. Amelia Cox is here with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:34. It is absolutely impossible that it will make a meaningful difference to the appalling backlog of asylum applications presided over by 14 years of Tory government, a period of 14 years in which a 73% decline in the number of rejected or failed asylum seekers being removed has fallen. It's down by 73% since 2010, and yet yesterday the world stopped to watch Rishi Sunak claim that it was A, going to work, and B, going to be a deterrent. This morning, 5 people died attempting to cross the channel. The adults presumably knew the risks. The child probably did not. They knew, if you like, that death was a possibility. Ergo, death becomes a de facto deterrent. Death is the deterrent. And still they came. So talk me through how the prospect of deportation to Rwanda, simultaneously a safe and lovely place where Suella Braverman would be happy to go on holiday, and if that's not a reason never to go there, then frankly I don't know what is, but also a destination so awful that it would deter people from crossing the channel more than the prospect of death. And of course, if you don't like any of this analysis, you talk me through what's wrong with it. Tracy's in Hull. Tracy, what would you like to say?
Hi, I'd like to say that I'm the unofficial adoptive mother of a 21-year-old Afghan asylum seeker. I got to know him because I volunteer in a centre for refugees and asylum seekers, and I know lots and lots of refugees and asylum seekers, and I try and help all of them, but this boy in particular kind of moved me because he's so articulate, he's studied really hard, he spends every spare moment he can studying English, working, and we became close, and now I kind of know his family. I'm included in video calls with them, and his mum has asked me to look after him.
Gosh.
And it just breaks my heart because he's basically in line for this Rwanda thing.
There were reassurances in the House yesterday that people who've come from Afghanistan would be okay if they had worked with the British military, but of course people who might be fleeing the Taliban for completely obvious and normal reasons, I don't think were covered by those caveats or those reassurances.
My son was 17 when his father persuaded him to leave because the Taliban weren't moving in. My son was working for USAID. Well, in fact, he was a schoolboy and he was chosen to represent his year group to volunteer with the USAID charity, trying to stop young boys joining the Taliban because 4 of his own friends had been killed by the Taliban. He comes from a rural area where Taliban have been the whole time that the coalition forces were there. He grew up in the crossfire between Americans and the Taliban, and his friends were killed because they joined the Taliban, and the Taliban sent the young boys out to shoot at drones, and they were all quite brutally murdered, actually. But so this made him not care about his own safety. He was determined to stop that happening to any other boys like himself. His father sent him to school in the city to keep him away from the Taliban. But when the Taliban came in, his name was known. He couldn't go back to his own village anymore because he was under threat.
Because he'd been trying to persuade his peers to turn against the Taliban.
Yeah, they knew what he was doing. He was taken in several times and beaten up by the Taliban, but his grandfather had persuaded them to let him go. But he would have been killed if he'd stayed. So he had to walk out of the country, stepping over dead bodies on the way because there was no way for him to get out. And now he's under threat from this Rwanda bill.
What's he going to do?
Christ, I don't know. I've just all along. Last year he actually arrived in.
I think, if I understand it correctly, that the people that the government is targeting first will already know, and I know that's scant comfort to you, but I don't think. I can't believe I'm about to say this in the United Kingdom on St. George's Day in 2024, but I don't think there's going to be a knock on the door anytime soon.
I don't know. He had a letter saying that all of his friends who came around the same time, he actually arrived in July 2022, so he misses that first cohort, and he comes between the second cohort, which were last year. But all of his friends who came at the same time all got their leave to remain, and his didn't come. And then he got a letter saying he had been sent the questionnaire by mistake, and his case was put on indefinite hold pending the result of this bill.
So this is the worst possible outcome for you and for him. What does he want to do if he does manage to stay here, Tracy?
If he stays here, honestly, he's really intelligent. He's come top in his level 1 English. So basically, he's at GCSE level now for English. He's a leader. That's why he was doing what he was doing in Afghanistan, because people automatically follow him. He plays for a local cricket club. He's just been picked for the first team for this year. He wants to start a business. He wants to do business studies. Volunteer. He volunteers for the same charity.
It must be odd for you doing what you do, not just with him, but with the other people you volunteer with, to be so conscious of and connected to their humanity, and then to turn on your radio. Even the BBC doesn't use the word humans or people. The word migrant, which is
illegals,
illegals even as a noun, which is deliberately, sometimes deliberately, sometimes accidentally dehumanizing. It's as if two different worlds. We're talking about two completely different organisms. The human beings, and then the whatever word Farage is using this week to describe these human beings that the news then picks up on.
I just look at it as a mother. I've in fact, his mother was on the phone yesterday, and he brought the phone to me and she's waving at me, and I'm thinking, I can't save your son.
Well, we don't know that yet. Just out of interest, because I am interested in. I'm a naive soul, probably a bit like you, or certainly idealistic, and I think if you make these points and if you offer up these explanations often enough, then some people who don't understand it or who pretend not to understand it may come to a better grasp of the facts. Why for him the UK? Why not the various other points of possible destination on the route?
It wasn't the UK, it was Germany. He went to Germany. He was still 17 at the time, so he was in under the care system in Germany. He learned the German language. He was really excited to stay there, and then the police came and took him back to Slovenia, where he'd had his fingerprints taken as a young boy.
Right.
He'd been walking for 8 days. In December 21, he's very, very articulate, and I've got his whole testimony written down.
Sure.
And the police caught this group of young boys and took their fingerprints.
In Slovenia.
And that's why he's on the list now, because Germany sent him back to Slovenia to a closed camp, and he got out over the fence and made his way back to Italy, and then he was forced to take a boat. I've also volunteered in Calais, and when people say, why don't they stay there? Because they're living like animals, being constantly beaten up by the police and having all their things taken away from them. The smugglers are a mafia that the police leave alone. I've had so many stories I've collected. I'm a writer. I've collected many, many stories. And the people who are responsible for this, if they want to stop the boats, they need to. Somebody said to me, they need to get a helicopter and drop into the enclave where the smugglers live, because the police don't even go there, because the smugglers are mafia, basically.
Sure, and presumably heavily armed.
I mean, one young man that I've spoken to saw somebody shot dead in front of him by those smugglers.
And why didn't he stay there? Is the question that I get.
Why didn't he stay there?
I'm going to read.
It's like they've been crowded. They're like lemmings. They've been crowded to the edge. There's nowhere to go from there. Most of them have tried to claim asylum in different countries and been refused for one reason or another. So it's not as if everybody is heading automatically to the UK.
No.
It's the last point when you get to that strip of land.
And I'm going to read you something which hadn't occurred to me before, but I don't think it's irresponsible to read it, because it's occurred to Christopher while you were talking, and I just want you to tell me, Tracy, whether or not anything akin to this has crossed your mind in the last few hours or the last few days. He writes, I can't believe I have to say this, James, but we actually have to start hiding people to keep them safe. It's St. George's Day, and this country hits an all-time low. I am no longer proud of my country. Has that thought crossed your mind at all?
Yes, it crossed my mind when I sat up and watched that bill go through last night, because I don't think my son can take it if he even goes into detention. When they deported him from Germany, He testifies that he wanted to kill himself, and it was his mother on the phone to him every day that stopped him from doing that.
So you put him in the attic?
I think they'd probably come here straight away if they were looking for him. We need an underground. We need a resistance. Gosh.
I didn't know what you were going to say in response to that, and I didn't know whether it would be the right thing to do to read it out, actually, because it may have flirted with hyperbole, but clearly not for the people living these stories, as opposed to merely reporting them like me or consuming them like the average punter, the people living them. I mean, come on, how's this going to work? How's this going to work? How's it going to be a deterrent? And even if you buy some of the rhetoric, you now have to include the 5 people dead in the Channel this morning in your description of why being deported to Rwanda would stop them getting in that boat, but the possibility of drowning in the English Channel would and indeed did not. That's going to stay with you, isn't it? I can't say that. I can't read your mind. That's going to stay with me. Looking after an Afghan refugee and thinking about hiding him from the authorities. Happy St. George's Day.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:48, and it is one of those mornings, isn't it, where you think you know what you're going to be talking about, but turns out you don't. The Safety in Rwanda bill will become law 2 years after the original policy was first announced in April 2022. Announced, I think, if memory serves, to distract attention away from all the law-breaking that had been going on in Boris Johnson's Downing Street. Wasn't it? Feel free to fact-check me on that. April 2022. So hard to remember, isn't it? And keep track of the corruption. It will become law, despite several members of the House of Lords, chiefly, I found crossbench peers with legal qualifications, or even Conservative peers with consciences, like Ken Clarke, who described it last year as some of the legislation as being like trying to legislate that a cat is actually a dog. But it will come in. Enforced removals of rejected asylum seekers are down 73% since 2010. And the current scheme is estimated to be able to accommodate approximately 0.7% of the people that came here last year alone. He says it's going to be off in 10 to 12 weeks. Of course, last time he spoke about it, he said that the flights would be off in spring. And he talks about a regular rhythm of multiple flights every month over the summer and beyond until the boats are stopped. So they've given up trying to stop the boats. They're trying to stop people getting into the boats. People like the 5 who died in the Channel this morning after getting into a boat. Oh, boy. Just explain it to me. Explain to me how you think it might work. You're more than welcome to ring in and tell me why you think it won't. But I have got a couple of phone lines free. We're keeping a couple of phone lines free just in case anybody wants to have a crack at explaining why being deported to Rwanda is a better deterrent than death. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. 10 minutes to 11 is the time. Tony is in Moorgate. Tony, what would you like to say?
What I would like to say, I arrived in the UK in 1993 and I applied for asylum. And when I applied for asylum, I was given a document with all my details saying I had no recourse to any public funding,
yes,
no recourse to housing and NHS, right?
Yes. And
then in order for me to survive, I became an independent living scheme carer, whereby I worked as a living carer, a person who's elderly or disabled, and I was given £20 a week pocket money. So which means the time that I was working as an independent, as a carer, a living carer, I was saving the British taxpayers an average of about £480 a week. Because that would have cost the social workers, social services to pay her on a full-time basis, right? I did that for 12 months. And then subsequently, after 12 months, I had to sign every 6 months. And after 12 months, they gave me a work permit. And then I continued working as a living carer. And then subsequently, I went on to university to study nursing. And then I went on to set up a small business, and I created jobs for people. Now, the question is, a lot of these people who come on the boats or whatever route they come in, these people are fleeing because of Britain's foreign policy.
So, some of
That's
them.
one of the problems you've
Some
got to
of
look
them.
at.
Some of them,
Some of
definitely.
them.
Yes,
Some of them,
I don't
okay.
think the Vietnamese people are, for example.
But
Where did you come from, Tony?
but
South
the point-
Africa?
I'm from South Africa. I came during the apartheid era.
Okay.
So
you were... Well, it's clear what you were getting away from, isn't it?
exactly. So people are getting away from persecution and this thing. So the point I'm trying to make is, instead of packing these people off and sending them off to Rwanda, where it's going to cost us millions of pounds, but actually the very same people they're packing off, they could train them as carers, they can train them as cleaners because they need them in the hospitals, they need them in the office buildings. We need people. We need fruit pickers. We need all that. So why can't they utilize that? They can work as volunteers, or they could work in some form whereby they get accommodation, they get like 20 or 30 pounds a week pocket money, so they are productive. And as the process is going on...
Yeah, but you can't do that. Because I think you're being rhetorical, Tony, because this is about it's about dehumanizing people like you, turning you into numbers and pledging to get the numbers down. So intelligent, emotionally and morally constructive policies that are designed to integrate people into society and into the workforce. I'm afraid they left the building in 2016. And when people like Nigel Farage got their season tickets for Question Time, enough of the British public have been persuaded that you're just a number and the number needs to be smaller. And whatever you did, the caring that you did, the job that you did, the future that you could have, the life that you've built, the family that perhaps you've raised, all of those things don't matter because you're not a human being, Tony. You're just a number. And we need to make that number smaller.
But the issue is this. One has to ask the question, why would anyone want to leave their home or leave where they are and go through the system they come through knowing there could be death along the way? Obviously, there is something that's really wrong. There's something that's not really good for them to make the journey. Obviously, it's just a common sense question to ask.
But when I listen to the frustration in your voice is almost like not music to my ears. That would be making light of it. But it's like the music of the spheres. It's so obviously ridiculous, especially on a day that we learn 5 people have died in the Channel. To claim that being deported to a place they keep telling us is beautiful is somehow going to prevent people undertaking this journey who undertake it in full knowledge that they could be dead by lunchtime.
Yeah, because the issue is this. The Conservative Party has lost its way. It's lost its morals and its way.
Yes.
Now, the only way they can do anything is by that. But also what they fail to understand, Rwanda has a history of its own where there's violence and everything. So I cannot understand. If they're going to pay 1.8 million per person to be there, there's so much they could do the 1.8 million in the UK. And also,
yes, but I've explained that to you. I wasn't being facetious. That they would rather spare. It's like Brexit. I don't care if I'm poorer. I just want to get rid of the immigrants. I don't care how much it costs. I just don't want them here. These are the people to whom they appeal. I don't think there are enough of these people to change an election result or anything like that. But the logic, if for want of a better word, the warped, disgusting logic of it, of a Suella Braverman or now a Rishi Sunak, the warped, disgusting logic of it is, I don't care if it costs too much money, and Rishi Sunak, of course, objected to it on the grounds of it being very bad value for money. The priority is to get rid of humans.
Yes, sir.
I'm so sorry.
That's sad. Yeah, I understand. I fully understand. And it also saddens me too, because I was given an opportunity to the UK. It's given me a second life. I'm very gracious and thankful for it. And this is why every morning when I wake up, I want to make a contribution to the society I live in. And the country is giving me a second home. And I think there's lots of people likewise. They appreciate and value the second chance they're given in life. And I think these conservatives and these people making the decisions, they're letting the country down. That's what they're doing.
Well, you can say that
and
again.
It saddens me.
Do you know what? They're letting our country down, Tony.
Yes.
All of us.
They are.
I'm going to read a tweet. I'm not asking you to respond to this. Thank you, Tony, and have a great day. But I'm going to read an example of perhaps what I was describing as being the kind of person to whom this sort of policy, despite being obviously amoral, statistically nonsensical, almost certainly destined to fail, who is it designed to appeal to? Mark is in Norwich. I'll read you his text in full because, I mean, it's almost poignant in its patheticness. James, I have explained it to you, but you just ignore me. We are extremely soft on crime, and they are coming here to go into the criminal underworld and commit crimes and make lots of money because our government is so soft. That is why they are coming here. But no doubt you will ignore me and ask the question again and again and again and again and again and again, says Mark in Norwich, who is listening to the same radio programme as you, whose vote is worth the same as yours, and who is, as far as I'm aware, allowed to use scissors unsupervised. Jonty's in St John's Wood. Jonty, what would you like to say?
Yeah, just a quick one, James. This hideous, disgusting, heinous policy. I'm ashamed of this government. But these guys have come, hitching lifts from Afghanistan across danger. That caller talking about her adopted child. These are extremely tenacious people willing to risk their lives crossing the channel. A few of them get deported to Rwanda. I've looked up where they're going to stay. Hope Hostel doesn't exactly look like a prison. They just walk out one day and they'll just come. Why won't they just come back? How is it even a deterrent from just coming back?
It's a logistical quibble rather than a moral one, but I don't know. You'd have to presume they might have answers to that question. Some of the housing that they were destined to be accommodated in has been sold to local residents. It was reported last week. They seem to have glossed very happily over all of that. It's as if the meaning of the policy is not in the detail or the delivery. It's in the rhetoric and the...
Is it just all emotion?
Yeah, the freedom it gave Rishi Sunak to make the speech he made yesterday, which I don't think, beyond our friend in Norwich there, who does it resonate with? When he says, no ifs or buts, right? He said right about 4,000 times.
You know what also really rankles me? I'm a third-generation immigrant, so, I'm very British.
So am I think. Third or fourth.
It makes me, a third-gen. So my grandpa came from Russia, and I'm so thankful to this country for giving me the opportunities I've had, and it really rankles with me that a second-generation immigrant prime minister is trumpeting these policies.
Yeah, it's you, and it rankles with you, and you are free to both feel that and to articulate it as you did very powerfully. It was explained to me very powerfully that you've got as much right to be anti-immigration or to want fewer immigrants coming here, because we almost, and I know you're talking about yourself and your own heritage, but you're almost diluting the belonging of the immigrant family. So because you are from an immigrant family, you have to be more accommodating of other immigrants coming here. It has an emotional pull, an appeal. It doesn't necessarily have a logical one or an intellectual one or a fair one, because you should be as entitled to have the opinion that you and I find toxic, regardless of what your family tree looks like.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 4 minutes after 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Change of pace now. I've mentioned this to you a few times when the news bulletin slaps you around the face like a wet fish. Rishi Sunak warning today as he announces £500 million more aid for Ukraine. And listen, I'm not suggesting for a minute that this is indicative of any broader truths, but the challenge of keeping the interest in Ukraine, the fight in Ukraine alive, has proved greater than I expected. It's partly because we run a phone-in programme here, but still the idea of a war on European soil unfolding in a way that we could not tear our eyes away from, quite understandably, at the outset, now almost drifting into background noise is chilling, not least when the UK Prime Minister warns, as Rishi Sunak is expected to do today, that Vladimir Putin will not stop at the Polish border. In other words, if he prevails in Ukraine, if he conquers and annexes Ukraine, he will continue. His business will not be complete any more than it was when I'm afraid we sat on our hands and he annexed Crimea. And by we, I don't mean you and me. I don't think we can take the blame for this one. But I think David Cameron was Prime Minister at the time in this country. Another glorious achievement for which he's been rightly rewarded with a seat in the House of Lords and a return to frontline politics as Foreign Secretary. This is good news in the context of what's going on in Ukraine. It follows, finally, the passing in America of a massive aid package that will see financial support, make its way to Ukraine along with Israel and Taiwan. But this is the largest ever delivery of military equipment, including armoured vehicles, boats, air defence missiles and ammunition. So the problem I've got is twofold. The first is keeping the flames of interest alive. The conversations, if you like, need to be informed and they need to be urgent. But we're human beings. Our attention is distracted. Some people still point at planes in the sky. We're a very easily distracted species, and I think we have, for good or for ill, or for ill actually, I think we have been distracted from Ukraine. But the question of whether or not Sunak is right, I mean, very few of us were alive in the 1930s. You remember when Chamberlain came back, waving his piece of paper and talking about peace in our time. History tells us that everyone thought he was ridiculous, but I bet they didn't. I bet Churchill knew that the writing was on the wall, or at least Churchill had bet his shirt upon Hitler invading other European countries and Hitler being embarked upon an imperial mission. But I bet you that huge swathes of the establishment breathed a sigh of relief and hoped that old Neville had got it right. Because I think the path of least resistance is often the most tempting. It's the most irresistible. I'd love to believe that Putin is going to stop when he got Crimea, but he didn't. In the horrible, tragic events of him conquering Ukraine, I'd love to believe that he'd stop at the Polish border. But he won't, says Rishi Sunak. And this is the kind of thing that maybe it's too big for us to properly contemplate, for us to keep our eyes on. And so that is the question. Ukraine's armed forces need our support, Sunak will say later. No, he has said already, actually, if Putin is allowed to succeed in this war of aggression, he will not stop at the Polish border. Right? Now listen to the next bit of this story. Russia has recently located, this is according to the president of Belarus, Russia has recently located I beg your pardon, the president of Poland, recently located its nuclear weapons to Belarus, right? To which Poland has responded by saying it's ready to host NATO nuclear weapons on its own land. That is an escalation, not of deployment, but of capability. He has said, President Andrzej Duda has said, if there were a decision by our allies to deploy nuclear weapons within the nuclear sharing also on our territory in order to strengthen the security of NATO's eastern flank, we are ready. That's a huge deal. I mean, the fact that you have a UK Prime Minister talking about a fascist dictator who won't stop at the Polish border, if that doesn't echo at all, if that doesn't have any resonance through the decades, then I'm afraid you're listening to the wrong radio programme. The problem is that Sunak's such a busted flush. You kind of just end up hoping he's having a stopped clock moment. Or if he is right, that it is almost by accident. He's not a man you trust. He doesn't even have the wherewithal to explain why he now, as a prime minister, chooses to ignore the sort of financial research that when he was a Goldman Sachs analyst, he relied upon for making all his big and difficult and highly expensive decisions. I touched on that at the beginning of the first hour. I wasn't expecting it to pop up again. Some people might say I was obsessed with Brexit. But Brexit, of course, plays a part in this as well. The warning of war on European soil was poo-pooed and dismissed as part of Project Fear. And now, guess what? We've got war on European soil. Would it have happened without Brexit and Donald Trump? Would Vladimir Putin have felt sufficiently emboldened? Would he have felt that he had destabilised previously sacrosanct and taken for granted standards in the West? I don't know. We'll never know. But I do know that we can have a fair crack at answering the question of whether or not history or your understanding of the current situation allows you to answer this question. Is Rishi Sunak right when he says that Putin will not stop at the Polish border? In the event of victory in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin will press on, and Poland, not for the first time in recent history, would be first on his hit list. So there it is. Hit the numbers now. You will get through. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And the second bit of it is this, and I don't think it's inappropriate of me to ask you this question. It's possibly a bit lazy of me, but I don't think it's inappropriate. Is how could it have been done differently? How could... Well, no, let's start at the beginning. Let's do the problem before we do the solution. It might be that the answers to these questions are obvious, but I'd like you to provide them anyway. Why has the interest in Ukraine dissipated so completely? You know, we've done our best, and many media outlets have. This isn't a pat on the back moment. You talk to people. We have guests who've come from the Ukrainian political establishment. We've spoken to great critics of Russia. The urgency of that quest was, do you know, the urgency of helping Ukraine was so clear and so obvious and so widely felt that we even became nice about refugees for a while. Admittedly, it was left to the British public to step up to the plate and provide shelter and support. But, you know, the government weren't telling them not to. The government weren't threatening to deport people who came here from Ukraine. I know that there are possibly racial undertones to that observation about the difference between perhaps a white refugee and a brown refugee. But such was the belief in the need to help Ukraine that we, even as a country, became warm towards refugees for a while. And of course, the king of self-interest, the king of calculated self-interest, Boris Johnson, calculated from a position of self-interest that being perceived as a great ally of Ukraine might help him get out of some of the trouble that his actual actions had got him into in the UK. So all of the ingredients were there for a sustained support of Ukraine. And yet, whether you are looking at the political agenda or the media coverage, I think it's fair to say the volume has been turned down from 10 to 2. And I'd like you to have a little think about why. So there are two questions this hour, and I'm not qualified really to answer either of them, but I might have a go in the middle of it all. The first is, how worried should we be that Vladimir Putin will not stop at the Polish border? And I would suggest that the precedent of Crimea provides one answer to that, and that answer is very worried. Is Rishi Sunak right on this? Because if he is, and this ties into the second question, if he is right, what the hell have the allies, why on earth have we not given Ukraine everything they need to repel him more effectively? They were running out of missiles at one point. And then the second question becomes, perhaps as a consequence of your answer to the first, why has it moved from being a story of such immense interest to the British people that we even became warm towards refugees, publicly warm towards refugees for a while, and yet in the intervening period, I would suggest that it had been turned down in volume from 10 to 2. And do you know what I know nothing about, except through personal experience of friends and family members who have provided a home to Ukrainian refugees? What's happened to that scheme? We might add that to the mix as well, although can we do that a bit later? So don't I can't start doing this. It's such an arrogant thing to do as a phone-in host. Don't ring me about this until 24 minutes past 11, and then I want you to ring me about that. And you can't ring me today because I only want to hear from you. Yeah, there's some shows that struggle to make the phones ring at all. They shall, of course, remain nameless. But I shouldn't be that picky. So yes, you come with me, and you tell me how that scheme, that refugee scheme, has unfolded in real life in your world. It's coming up to 11:15, and stop the clocks. I'm hitting a break on time.
James O'Brien on LBC.
17 minutes after 11. On a rather lighter note, I have got some absolutely peachy unhinged headlines for you today. In fact, I don't think you'll be surprised to learn 2 supremely unhinged headlines on the same page of the same newspaper. There are absolutely no prizes for guessing which newspaper it is, but do stay tuned for those. They are, even by the standards of unhinged headlines, they are absolute doozies. And I think there's one that we missed over the course of the weekend. I think there was one on Saturday that is a contender for the best of the year. Although, you know what my memory's like. It may well be that we did it on Friday. Can anyone remember the one we did on Friday? Do you remember? I just having a private conversation with the producer now. Do you remember when we said we were going to start keeping a list of all the unhinged headlines? Did that happen? Hello? Did that happen? Did we start keeping a list of all the unhinged headlines? Did we? Anybody? Oh, well. 18 minutes, someone else can do it. You can do it, okay? Just keep a list of it and send it to me whenever I ask for it via WhatsApp on 0345 606 0973. To Russia. Chris is in Chatham. Chris, what do you think?
Yes, thanks, James.
Yeah.
Will Russia push on? Given past performance, I think very likely.
It's almost a no-brainer. I mean, there are people waiting to talk who say the opposite, so it's clearly not a no-brainer, but as soon as you said given past performance, I felt some of the grey dissipate on this question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking and thinking, Georgia, he's working on at the moment.
Yeah.
Moldova, through the pressures from Transnistria, he's working on that. And if you look at that, that's going to create a pinch. It's going to put Ukraine on two fronts. If Russia steps into Transnistria and then Moldova falls, he's then got clear access through to Odessa and then will push straight up towards Kiev on both sides. So thank God that money from America has appeared and we're putting the extra money in as well, and we can start getting the Patriot systems and things like that in there to start protecting the airspace, get the F-16s flying, etc. Then after that, will he go for Poland? I don't think so yet, but I think there's more likely to be a push for unrest in Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, potentially Slovakia, and given Fico's position, there's something weird going on there because there seems to be a lot of ground support in Slovakia for Ukraine, but the president and the prime minister there are anti-Ukraine, pro-Russia. So I'm not really sure what's going to happen there. But they're a member of NATO. They may decide to pull out of NATO and let Mother Russia come in. But difficult to say. But I think there'll be a lot of pressure in the Baltic states from the Russian diaspora that are there, in the same way as they did in Crimea, in Donetsk, etc., to start calling out for help because we're being oppressed. And there's already these rumblings going on there at the moment about, we're being oppressed, we're getting this, we're getting that, and they're starting to get some noises for Kaliningrad. There's been interference with civil airliners flying in the Baltic Sea, with the indication pointing towards Russia, although there's no
confirmation
proof, no confirmation or proof yet. But who else is going to do that? I mean, it's not going to be the Germans playing around with it, or the Danes, or the Swedes.
You're providing more questions than answers, really, unintentionally.
Sorry.
No, that's how these things work. That's how diplomacy works, isn't it? But why has it taken so long for America and subsequently the UK to come forward with support that's so obviously and desperately needed, and perhaps more urgently needed than many people in both America and the UK, other European countries as well, of course. Some have done rather more than us, some not as much. Why is it? What? Explain the logjam to me. Why the logjam?
Could I use Marjorie Taylor Greene as an example?
If you absolutely must.
I am so sorry that I have to.
So this is the political arithmetic of the American Congress, really?
Yes.
And this pro-Putin, pro-Trump rump of complete and dangerous idiots have managed to throw a spoke in the wheels, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, putting in amendments like anybody that votes for this should immediately volunteer to fight for the Ukrainian army.
I think she was on with Tucker Carlson 2 or 3 weeks ago, suggesting that the Speaker of the House was being blackmailed to do the bidding of the left. This is a conversation for a different day, and I don't think many people pay close attention to it. But do these people know that they're doing the bidding of Vladimir Putin, or do they think that they're brave I don't know, counter protesters or brave original thinkers? We'll never know, will we? We might as well ask that question about some British politicians.
Yes.
So I get that. It doesn't explain the UK bit. Are you suggesting the UK couldn't have gone all in on, or couldn't have done what it's done today until America had done what it did earlier this week?
No, I think they could have done, but I think there were other bits of politics and spending and stuff like that. I think now that I don't want to try and link it with the boats and things like that, but now that bit's sort of in the clear, we can now put out some more good news as well, so we can feed people with the.
So it could all be about this election whenever it actually occurs. Chris, thank you. I won't hit you with the question of why you think interest has diminished, because there are so many other people waiting to get in touch, and I like to mix it up a little bit. But that is. I mean, you can't possibly get past that, maybe not with reference to the Polish border, but the idea that Vladimir Putin, if he conquers Ukraine, will suddenly relax, sit back and smoke a cigar seems to be fanciful, to say the least, doesn't it? Paul's in Maidenhead. Paul, what would you like to say? Paul?
Hello?
Hello, Paul. What would you like to say, mate?
Yeah, as a Polish person, and I got quite good knowledge of the history between us and Russia.
Yeah.
I don't think it's possible again for Putin and Russia to go behind the Polish border. I don't think NATO is touchable for him. I don't think he even wants to be in Ukraine. Longer it takes, he just sees some kind of perks of it. Just from oil price going up, he's quite happy to sell it to China and the other way. So he's not bothered by not selling to Germany his resources. So I
just have to pause you briefly and say, if he doesn't want to be there, why did he go there?
He did go there because he was trying to get his kind of, it's my neighborhood.
Yeah, but that hasn't changed, has it? So he still thinks that.
Yeah, but look, he knows that there are borders he cannot cross. He knows NATO open war is end of all his mates, oligarchs, and all rich people. Their lives would be finished the way they have it now. Why he would risk it? Because he's stealing from Russian people. He's milking them to the bottom.
Of course, but I can answer that question. I can answer that question from people, and I can tell you what people very, very close to the scandals and the thefts that you describe would say. I think possibly even my friend Vladimir Kara-Murza, who since the murder of Alexei Navalny has become perhaps the highest profile opposition politician in Putin's jails, they would say that the war is the way in which he keeps the truth from the people. The war is the way in which he keeps the people inflamed and excited, so that they will never turn their attention to the epic plundering of the country that Vladimir Putin and his cronies have undertaken pretty much since he got into the Kremlin.
Yes, but war to certain extent. You don't want total war. You don't want to push it. You just want it. You would rather keep it acceptable to certain extent.
But no,
it's not acceptable anymore in Israel and Palestine. It's not acceptable anymore. And you know what people are talking about. People are saying that's enough. This is the end.
Well, some people are. There's plenty of other people pushing back. People aren't saying it about Ukraine and Russia, and I think because, look, the invasion, it's not the same. I understand parallels will be drawn between two conflicts, but for a sovereign country to invade another sovereign country and seek to conquer and annex it is measurably different from what Hamas did on October the 7th and what Israel have done subsequently. So I don't know how helpful that is.
Both of the situations are making people rich and just follow the money. How simple.
Yeah, we're moving off the main point now.
It is.
I appreciate that. War suits the interest of... Go on.
I don't think Putin would risk going against NATO.
No.
He's just going to push. He would never go to... Poland is well more prepared than Ukraine for any kind of situation like that. Going against Poland itself would be much harder than against Ukraine, and Poland would have so much more support from the NATO.
It would be a completely different proposition. I think you're right. That perhaps is why, as Chris suggested, it might be some of the non-NATO Baltic states that would be higher up on his wish list. But I think if you accept the idea, I mean, perpetual war is I think it's an Orwellian notion, isn't it? If you accept the idea that war is the most powerful way with which to keep your own population compliant, then at some point it could happen because he'd have run out of other places to go. But I hear you, and I'm pretty sure if I was Polish, I would want to agree with every single thing that you've just said. But, of course, there is room for people listening to disagree. The number you need to do that is, of course, 03456060973. Sunak's words, which are probably worth repeating, are: defending Ukraine against Russia's brutal ambitions is vital for our security and for all of Europe. If Putin is allowed to succeed in this war of aggression, he will not stop at the Polish border. Ukraine's armed forces continue to fight bravely, but they need our support, and they need it now. Which leads us to the second question that we're asking today, which is twofold. Partly, why such a delay when Ukraine has made it clear for months now that they were in desperate need of more military support? And why does the volume on the coverage go down, particularly in a country which managed to wean itself off refugee hatred for a few months and welcome Ukrainians with open arms? 03456060973 is the number you need. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
32 minutes after 11. My thanks to Chris Rankin, who's appointed himself as an assistant producer of the programme, by which I mean he simply remembers previous episodes of Unhinged Headline. He's been in touch to say the one you did on Friday, James, was EU would rather destroy planet than see Brexit succeed. And I suggested to you on Friday that might win. That might be the most unhinged headline of 2024. I think there was some competition for that by Saturday, actually, one that I haven't shared with you, but will share with you shortly. I mean, the other one on the 18th of April, of course, came from David Frost. Oh, yes. He went for Islamists and the woke left are uniting to topple the West. It's sort of, you'd almost want to conduct an experiment and create someone who believes all this bilge that's published in the Daily Telegraph and then work out what kind of person it turns you into. But I don't have the time or the resources to conduct an experiment like that. What I do have is 3 unhinged headlines, at least 2 of which are... Well, at least one of which is a challenger for the most unhinged headline of the year, and the other 2 of which appear on the same page of the same newspaper today. And there are absolutely no prizes for guessing which newspaper. So that will come shortly, after 1 or 2 more calls on the subject of Rishi Sunak's warning that Vladimir Putin will not stop at the Polish border in the unhappy event of him conquering Ukraine. Cormac is in Kennington, a regular contributor to LBC on this issue, not least because he used to be a former senior civil servant working in precisely this field. Cormac, what's your answer to this question?
James, good morning and thank you. My answer to this question is Rishi Sunak is absolutely correct. Could I just tell a very, very brief story? Over 7 years ago, when I was working as a special communication advisor to the foreign minister of Ukraine, I spoke to the editor of a British broadsheet. It was The Guardian, and this is still online. And the editor said, we would really like to know what advice the foreign minister would give other foreign ministers and other people in government across Europe about Russia. And I held the pen, as one does, on that op-ed, but the headline of that op-ed, which is still online, is Putin will not stop at Ukraine in his desire to put the Russian Empire back together. My broader point on this is we need to listen to the Ukrainians and the Baltics and the Poles and the people. And laterally, why do we think Finland and Sweden have given up their neutrality to join NATO? I've been working with these people since 2016. They will tell us
the real danger of Russia because they live with it and they live as Russia's neighbours. We need to give more respect to these people. So, yes, Rishi Sunak is absolutely correct. And the other thing I'd say, by the way, your first caller, Chris, I'd like to commend on his assessment of the situation. The other thing I'd like to say, if we should allow Putin to be successful in Ukraine, one, it is a genocidal scenario for Ukraine. It would be, the estimates have been, we would see between 10 and 20 million more refugees flood into Europe. And we know from Syria that Putin has no compunction in weaponizing refugees, as he did back in, I think it was 2015, with the Syrian crisis. So, the whole Russian hybrid warfare is aimed at destabilizing Europe. And the final thing, James, is if that horrible scenario were to happen and Putin were to be allowed succeed in Ukraine, it would embolden North Korea, it would embolden Syria and Iran, but in particular, I believe it would embolden China to go full in on Putin's side. And then we have a serious situation. But speak to the people in the Baltics who are NATO members, who are
more fearful than they have been for a generation.
They are very, very fearful.
The prospect, and I don't want to make light of anything that you've just said, but just halfway through that, when you talked about the prospect of an exodus of humanity from Ukraine in the event of a Russian victory, I suddenly realised that we could, if the political calculus in this country goes completely haywire, we could be hearing conversations about deporting Ukrainians to Rwanda within a couple of years' time, which would be quite the moment. What about the specifics of Poland, Cormac? The idea that expansionism and Putin go hand in hand, and you're quite right to refer us to the people of the eastern neighbourhoods, the Baltics, but Poland itself much better placed than Ukraine to resist a Russian offensive. And I mean, I guess I'm asking about the argument that, yes, Putin's imperial ambitions will not end with Ukraine, but Poland wouldn't be on the top of the list.
Well, I'm not sure about that, James. Okay. Poland is a powerful military force and a member of NATO. But I go back, and I apologise that I can't take the chap's name off the top of my head. But it was the Polish president
Pavel,
or
probably.
prime minister,
yes,
at the end of last year.
Oh, sorry, Andrzej Duda.
Said, the fastest way to a third world war was to allow Putin succeed in Ukraine. So I think that about sums up the Polish position. I don't think anybody in the eastern neighbourhood, the Baltics, Poland, or Finland and Sweden, would have complete confidence in NATO and Article 5 should Putin succeed in Ukraine. We have the added fear now that can we rely on America as a reliable security partner? If Trump were to get back in, I would say definitely not.
Yes.
But I think there are even question marks with the Biden administration and Jake Sullivan as national security advisor. There is a sense that there seems to be a fear among some of actually defeating Russia.
Questions of appetite for that battle then. And if you would, a quick word on why you think the urgent need let's focus on the UK, not America. Why is Rishi Sunak, better late than never is a powerful phrase and one that no doubt Volodymyr Zelensky would subscribe to today with regard to British aid, British support. Better late than never. But just why so late? Well, the need for this has been clear for months. Why have we only just delivered it now?
Sorry, James. At the risk of going against you on this, Britain has been one of Ukraine's greatest allies from the very start. And, I'll declare no fan of this particular government.
For sure. But the latest announcement, the 500 million additional funding, you feel that's on schedule? You don't feel that has come a little late?
Not necessarily.
Fine.
We already announced earlier on this year that we were, I think, donating 300 million more than last year to Ukraine aid. So this is additional aid. Whether it has been prompted and made easier by the approval of the 61 billion, I really don't know. But I think, in fairness, we have got to say, and it's a national thing, it's not just a political thing, that Britain has been from the very start among the staunchest supporters of Ukraine. So I'm not sure that our government warrants criticism on that particular point.
Well, that's nice, isn't it? What a lovely thing to hear in the context of all the days when it warrants more criticism than we can manage to squeeze into 3 hours. And so, right on all counts, right to do it, not belated, and right to warn that Poland could be next.
You know, James, I spoke to 5 military veterans out in Berlin, Ukrainians who had fought since 2014. I was doing some work with them, with Ukraine's ambassador to Berlin, who's a personal friend. And we had a bit of a reception afterwards. We were having a few beers and a few hot dogs. And I went and I spoke to the military guys. And I always asked them, because when I was in Ukraine, I was a diplomat. So they would be guarded in what they would say to me about Britain.
Yes.
And I say to them, look, guys, I left government at the end of 2018. Tell me what you really think about the Brits. And every time I ask that question, Ukrainian soldiers and politicians and diplomats tell me that they believe Britain is their absolute best friend. And if everybody else is supporting them as we do, then, you know, this war might well be over, and it might well be over in Ukraine's favour.
So hopefully Rishi Sunak then will be injecting a little bit of that resolve into his counterparts in Germany, where I think he is set to visit next on this trip. Thank you, Cormac Smith, to give him his full name, as you heard, former diplomat working in precisely this part of the world, and therefore better placed than most of us to have a look at what is happening and what is likely to transpire next. One thing you can say for certain is that Russia, what Number 10 described as the barbaric assault, is certain to be ramped up as summer approaches and fighting conditions essentially improve. And the package announced today is a direct response to the specific asks. Did I say asks? Why can't they say requests? It's just a little small pedantic point, but the specific request from the Ukrainian government and armed forces. I think we will allow ourselves. Should we go? Yeah, should we go for a double header on this one? A double header, and then the one from Saturday that I think is up there as a possible most unhinged of the year headline. They all come, and listen, I am more than happy to accept nominations for unhinged headline from a newspaper that isn't the Daily Telegraph, but at the moment the Daily Telegraph have got an almost complete monopoly on
unhinged headline.
So the first one I've got, remember, these two come from the same newspaper on the same day. Truly, the Daily Telegraph is the gift that keeps on giving. This is by a commentator, and I use the word loosely, called Sherelle Jacobs, and she writes, "Endemic misery is pushing the UK towards a civilizational catastrophe." Who had civilizational catastrophe on their unhinged headline bingo sheet today? No, you didn't, you liar. Endemic misery is pushing the UK towards a civilizational catastrophe. And it falls to me once again to remind you that the comment pages of the Daily Telegraph are populated almost exclusively with people who were pro-David Cameron, pro-austerity, pro-Theresa May, pro-Brexit, pro-Boris Johnson, pro-Liz Truss, and are now pro-Rishi Sunak. And yet somehow the endemic misery that has taken grip over the last 14 years is pushing the UK towards a civilizational catastrophe. And now for our second
unhinged headline.
And this is from a writer called Judith Woods. And in many ways it's my favourite, although it's not the most unhinged. She's written an article under the headline, "The shortage of public lavatories is proof Britain despises its old." Yeah. Damn right, I think, or something. There is a story in the news today that we were thinking about talking about regarding the definition of old and how it's shifting. I wonder if you can guess what the age is now at which we genuinely believe old age kicks in. But I have to go back to the weekend to provide you with the headline that I think challenges. We've had this one. EU would rather destroy planet than see Brexit succeed. That was That was written by someone called Jamie Blackett, who I hadn't come across before, but I'm delighted to have discovered him, albeit belatedly. Destroy the Planet. I don't think this one is going to challenge it, but this is by someone called Camilla Tominey, and this is, right up there in the annals of unhinged headlines. She's gone for this, and I want you to stop and think about this. And think about what these words mean. For a start, what do the words 14 years... Just listen to this, right? You ready for this? 14 years of Tory rule have left Britain a lazy, dangerous, left-wing mess. So 14 years of getting exactly what you wanted under 5 different Conservative prime ministers have somehow left Britain a lazy, dangerous, left-wing mess. I think that this fella's still ahead, isn't he? EU would rather destroy planet than see Brexit succeed. Are we? That's the winner, right? Still, that's still ahead. Is that more unhinged than 14 years of Tory rule have left Britain a lazy, dangerous left-wing mess? It is, isn't it? Because destroying the planet rather than see Brexit succeed, that is still the winner, the leader at least. And it's only April the 23rd. Happy St. George's Day. That is still the leader in the 2024 most.
Unhinged headline.
It's 11:46.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 11:49. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I've told you, haven't I, that I worry about the gatekeepers of news, particularly Brexity news, because so many people, and unfortunately you don't even have to look far beyond the walls of this studio to know who I'm talking about. So many people encouraged you to vote for it, and yet you still rely upon them to tell you what's going on in the world, and they won't, because it makes them look so stupid for having told you to vote for Brexit. And Project Fear is now almost like a to-do list. You can just tick off all of the threats of Project Fear as they become reality. Criminality, of course, was mooted as being a big possible problem in the event of new border controls and new border checks being put up. And this is something that Emma Core, LBC's correspondent in the Southeast, has been looking at with particular interest. And she has unearthed something of an exclusive. Emma joins me now. Emma, tell me more.
Well, James, first and foremost, we know criminal stealing from lorries is already at an all-time high. Figures we've seen show £68 million worth of goods were stolen from lorries in the UK alone last year, and much of that isn't reported. So the true cost to hauliers is around 10 times higher, and drivers at a truck stop in Kent I've been speaking to have told me they're constantly battling with criminal gangs slashing their lorry curtains looking for valuable goods, including food.
It's always been bad, but it just seems to be getting worse.
They just walk up with a stone, cut them, if there's anything in it.
I feel very angry and a little bit scared. Somebody's walk around my trucks.
And has that happened here in the UK or in Europe? Or
in
both?
UK, yeah, mostly in UK.
And with inflation still high, James, the appetite for the black market when it comes to food has grown and grown. Olive oil, James, is nicknamed liquid gold in Europe. A lorry load of meat can have a value of up to £300,000. So criminals targeting lorries transporting food has become a big problem because it can be sold on very quickly online. And hauliers are essentially worried, James, when these new physical checks on goods come in.
Yes, I was about to ask you about that. That is a week today, and there are warnings already that is going to involve, a lot more lorries being parked up for a lot longer.
Exactly, and these checks obviously coming in around animal products, coming in from meat coming in from Europe, eggs coming in from Europe, cheese introduced by the government here so they can monitor what's coming over from Europe, with of course that's no longer part of the EU. And hauliers worried that that's basically going to be a really lengthy process, and they've told me they're expecting to see a massive backlog of lorries waiting to be called for inspection, meaning more drivers having to park up in Kent, increasing the opportunity for crime. Ashton Cull is from the Road Haulage Association and has raised these concerns.
There could well be significant delays, impact on the flow of vehicles. If that leads to vehicles parked up in unsecure areas, then it is only going to make them a honeypot for organised criminals to come and attack.
And another point to make here as well, James, of course, is that these checks aren't being done in Dover as lorries roll off ferries, but 22 miles inland at Sevington, deep into Kent. The government say that site in Sevington has robust security and has the capacity to hold 4,000 lorries. But Phil Pluck, the chief executive of the Cold Chain Federation, has told us that leaves more time and opportunity for criminals.
You have a series of points between Dover and Sevington where you can just go, and that product will not be on the back of that lorry an hour later. A container full of frozen prawns has a value of around about £250,000. There will be some elements in this country that would take a chance and try and get it.
So these checks, James, coming in this time next week, more to come in October as well. That's when fruit and veg will be checked. And of course, also concerns being raised that deliveries on the whole will be slower because of these checks. So hauliers, I think, are very nervous about this, particularly that the criminal element, the impact any backlog will have on encouraging criminals to steal goods from lorries, which is already happening.
So if it gets there at all, it'll be later, and if it gets nicked, it won't get there at all. That's win-win, really, isn't it? What turned you on to this story, Emma? What made you look into it?
I was looking into the post-Brexit check process anyway, James, and it was when hauliers began to raise the concerns around criminality that it became particularly interesting that criminal gangs potentially will target these lorries just sat in Kent waiting to be checked. And of course, freight crime already at an all-time high, so this is very likely that this could happen.
I know you've written it up for the LBC website, for lbc.co.uk, and of course, if anyone's struggling to understand the appeal for the criminal class, just needs to be asked the question of what would happen if someone was told there was £250,000 in banknotes sitting in the back of one of those lorries over there. I mean, the scale, the value of these cargoes it can be huge, absolutely huge.
Absolutely massive. Phil Pluck there saying he just used the example of prawns, £250,000 worth of prawns in one lorry. And of course, as I said, inflation's so high, the black market for these goods is huge now, and they can be sold very quickly online, and that's why criminal gangs are really going for food.
On a less serious note, Emma Core, the price of olive oil is so prohibitive now. I contemplated going down a standard relatively recently. I was walking through the aisles of Morrison's, thinking that this is absolutely extraordinary, the price of olive oil. So again, more of an attraction for potential thieves. Emma Core there, LBC South East correspondent, sharing with you another story that is unlikely to be brought to you by the people who told you to vote for Brexit. Project Fear, of course, fast becoming Project Here, and I have taken it upon myself to tick the occasional box of stories that you probably won't hear anywhere else, but you'll hear it on LBC, at least on this show. Back to Russia. Stu's in Plymouth. Stu, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. We sort of spoken on this subject before. I rang you last year when we talked about the West providing tanks to Ukraine. If you remember,
you used to be your job, didn't it? Military and
yes. Former intelligence corps military analyst. In answer to your question, is Putin going to stop at Ukraine? No, he's not, and we can already see signposts for this already happening. His plans beyond Ukraine. We're seeing Russian agitators in Moldova trying to destabilise the situation in Moldova to make it more of a harsh regime in that area, or a harsh sort of situation in that area, and to destabilise the whole sort of social structure there. But more importantly, what we're seeing now, it's already happening, is the reorganisation of the military structures in the west of Russia. Back in the early 2000s, they sort of downsized their command and control structures of the military districts, and they formed the Western Military District, which pretty much covered the whole of Russia. What we're seeing now is the Southern Military District still is focused on Ukraine, but he's now forming or reforming the Leningrad Military District up in St. Petersburg and the Moscow Military District. Now, there's only one reason why he would do that, and that would be to face up to move into NATO or into NATO territory, particularly the Baltic states. Now, if he takes the Baltic states, if he takes Ukraine and secures Ukraine up to the Polish border, that in effect fixes NATO across a far wider front line. So the NATO divisions and the core headquarters are going to be covering that Polish-Ukrainian border into Romania, especially if Moldova sort of like falls down to Russian influence. And that prevents those formations from moving up to the Polish Kaliningrad border to protect the Baltic states against any incursion into the Baltic states from the Russian forces, which obviously with the Moscow and the Leningrad military districts formed there now, there's more impetus for them to do that. So it's in Putin's favour to secure Ukraine, fix NATO in that area, and then that gives them more freedom of movement to move into the Baltic states and closes NATO down.
No question in your mind that is what he would want to do.
Yeah, of course it is. And now he's probably emboldened at the moment the way things are in the US. Your previous caller, Cormac, who's obviously extremely experienced in this area. Trump is no sort of major fan of NATO. That was clear after his last time in the Oval Office. And if he gets in there again, I think that would be a signal to Putin that America isn't really going to come and bail NATO out if that happens. We're already aware. We've seen it in countless occasions before where Putin has been trying to divide Western democracies, and NATO would be a big target of that. So if he can introduce some division into NATO, it's going to be less likely that they're going to react to any incursion into the Baltic states. We got Hungary is obviously a more sympathetic government to Russia than some of the other states within NATO. But if he can introduce that division into NATO while moving into the Baltic states, NATO is fixed along that Polish-Ukrainian border. Is NATO really going to want to come in and come to the defence of three important but very small in terms of territory?
Well, you're the second person to say it. So, I mean, a treaty's only worth the paper that it's written on, in other words.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Crikey. So if you...
and that's the thing. I mean, some of the government, I mean, the traditional strong members of NATO, like the UK, Germany, France, aren't going to stand with it. But, NATO is a democratic treaty. It's an organisation, and it needs everyone to agree to any terms. If America's not going to provide the aid or the manpower or the military hardware to come to the aid, are some of those countries in NATO really going to say, well, we'll just go it alone without America? They're not going to be able to do it. Now, a Russian invasion of a NATO territory is a completely different beast to invading Ukraine. Ukraine is a standalone territory. Yeah. Its armed forces are smaller, much smaller than Russia, and it isn't as well equipped. NATO obviously does have the equipment and the manpower, but it's that political resolve. And that's what Putin is banking on, is that political resolve isn't there to actually come in.
His history is peppered with examples of him testing.
Exactly, yeah, exactly.
Resolve and being proved right, usually.
Yeah, usually, because no one's prepared to stand up to him. Now, the problem is, could he defeat NATO conventionally? No, he couldn't. Not a chance. But he has the nuclear arsenal, and that's his ace up his sleeve, which gets everyone panicking and says, like, well, is it really a bad thing for us if Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania come under the Russian sphere of influence again, and we're just left alone? But clearly, in the longer term, that is going to give great security in Europe.
Thank you, mate. Once again, knocking it out of the park. But in conclusion, and a slight pushback on Paul's optimism, and optimism is a good thing, but it is, of course, the hope that gets you, the despair we can deal with. To understand Putin, it's not just about imperial ambition and aggression and annexation and expansion, but if he loses power, he loses his life. It's so, sustaining the wheels of war, keeping them turning, keeps the population both compliant and supportive, keeps dissent at bay. If a country's at war and you start criticising the government, you're in a slightly different space than you are when a country is in a time of peace and you're criticising the government. So just a little reminder from the analysis that I missed earlier. It's 1 minute after 12.
James O'Brien on LBC.
5 minutes after 12 is the time. So I got a tweet this morning. And it said, James, you should talk about this on your show. And I read the story and I thought, crikey, yeah, that's a really good story. And now I've lost it, having decided that is what we are going to talk about on our show. Luckily, there's at least one person on the team who's capable of operating a search engine. And I found it. This is a really mad moment, I think, in demographic development. In 1997, right, if you were aged between 18 and 34, and this statistic, by the way, is lost in the story that I'm referring to. It has been picked up from within the copy, as it were. In 1997, if you were aged between 18 and 34, and the ages are important here, what do you think was the most common living arrangement for an adult in that age range? So, let's think what all the living arrangements might be. You would be living in a shared house perhaps, you'll be living alone, either as a renter or as a buyer. So that's 3, in a way, living arrangements. But we won't distinguish between renting and buying. We're just looking at the living arrangement rather than the affording arrangement. So you could be living in a shared property or living on your own. All right? You could be living as a couple. That doesn't count as a shared property. By shared property, I mean HMO, as they've become known latterly, a house of multiple occupancy. And I suppose you could be living as a couple with a child or with children. So that's 4. You've got a house of multiple occupancy, you've got living alone, you've got living as a couple alone, and then living as a couple with a child, and then you've got living as a single parent. That's that off the top of your head. Remember your age between 18 and 34. Would those be the 5 most obvious? Would you think? House of multiple occupancy, living on your own, living in a couple with no child, living in a couple with a child, and living as a single parent. Can you think of anything we've missed off that list? Those are, so talking about 1997, and those would be the 5 of, just thinking out loud. Okay, the most common living arrangement for an adult aged between 18 and 34 today is not on that list. It's not exactly Sherlock Holmes territory, but I just genuinely and authentically went reaching for things, thinking about, I used a midpoint, so I used 26, which is a midpoint between 18 and 34. That's maths, that is. So I used 26 as a midpoint, and I thought, well, I was living with a girlfriend at 26. My wife was living with her husband at 26. Me, by the way. I know it's not. So using the midpoint of 26, what are you most likely to be? Still living in a shared occupation, occupied, got a place of your own, might be living in a couple and had a kid, or you might have. So what were you doing at 26? Because if you take that as the midpoint between 18 and 34, then that way we break down the averages. These are the things you are most likely to be doing. What were you doing at 26? Living in an HMO, living on your own, living in a couple with a child or 2 or 7, or living as a single parent. And none of those are on the list. None of those constitute the most common living arrangement for an adult aged 18 to 34 today. So what does? It is obvious, I grant you, but it's bloody shocking, isn't it? The most common living arrangement for an adult aged between 18 and 34 in 2024 is living with your parents. In 1997, it was being in a couple with children. Now, of course, you might still be in a couple with children, but in 1997, they were the only people in your home. You, your partner, and your child and or children. Today, the most common living arrangement for any adult aged between 18 and 34 is to be living with your parents. The percentage changes are relatively small, but big enough to flip the top spot. And what it means, of course, or when you add it to the fact that first-time buyers are facing the toughest conditions in 70 years to buy a home, according to a report yesterday from the Building Societies Association, you get an idea of what the future looks like. A large part, or the largest part, perhaps, of the problem is very simply that earnings have not kept up with house prices. So the property market will be driven by people either getting onto it as a consequence of inheritance, i.e. as a consequence of money that comes from someone who was already on it, or it will be people moving from a property to a property, property owners changing the property that they own. First-time buyers, people coming in to the market for the first time, are facing a multi-generational nightmare. The toughest circumstances in which to try to be a first-time buyer that we have had for 70 years. You need 2 well above average incomes to even contemplate buying a house, buying a home now. And that research, which comes from the Resolution Foundation, is absolutely mad. But it's also normal. In fact, that works both ways. It's also normal, and it's all so normal. That probably. I mean, that's me indulging my enthusiasm for words there a little bit too enthusiastically. It's also normal, and what am I saying? Am I saying it's all so normal, or am I saying it's also normal? I was actually saying it's also normal, but I could equally have meant, because it would also be true, that it is all so normal. Which means that people like me don't really I have the right to have this conversation, but I don't really have, what's the word that I want? I don't really have anything to say on the subject. My own children are still a bit young. Actually, I've got an 18-year-old and she's still living at home, but that would be relatively normal even in 1997, wouldn't it? Especially if you were getting ready to go away to college or something like that. So I don't have any particular skin in this game yet. I might have in a few years. But what I do now is imagine being 26, or imagine being 28, or imagine being 33 and married with a child and still living with my parents. Or not even still living with my parents. I presume I would have moved out for a bit and then moved back in again. So I am conscious of being offensive. And as you know, if you listen to the programme on a regular basis, I do not like being accidentally offensive. I am a huge fan of being deliberately offensive. But I don't like it when I do it by accident, because I like to see the whites of your eyes if I'm going to offend you. I like to be offensive to your face, not behind your back. And I could be accidentally offensive here, because I could talk about it, A, as if it's awful when it isn't, or B, as if it's somehow your own. I'm not that awful. I would never do that. I'm never going to be an in my day-itis. You're never going to hear me say, well, I worked very hard. You need to cancel your Netflix subscription and eat fewer avocados if you want to buy a house. Again, our favourite newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, often runs articles by people in their 20s who are revealing the secrets of becoming a homeowner at such a young age. And normally by the third or the fourth paragraph, the very fifth at the latest, it turns out that they got a heck of a lot of help off mummy and daddy, or they received a legacy from a dead great-grandparent or grandparent. So it's all so normal to be living at home with your parents. But I actually don't know what it's like. And I can't even begin to imagine what it's like. And sometimes on the programme, it is really helpful and interesting for people who know what something's like to tell those of us who don't know what something's like what something is like. It is a exercise, I suppose, in illumination. The number you need is 0345 6060973. And the question that you will answer is, what was it like? What is it like? Because I don't know now, and I hesitate to remind you how long I've been presenting this programme, but you probably know already. Subjects that I will approach in a completely different way from how I would have approached them 20 years ago are becoming my favourite sort of subjects. So 20 years ago, if you were 26 and you were still living at home with your parents and you were in a partnership and you had a child, I would have concluded that something had gone a bit wrong. That might have been offensive, but it would have been deliberately offensive. I would have known what I was suggesting. I don't think you can sit here in 2024, not look at these figures from the Resolution Foundation and say that if you're in a couple and you're still living at home, you're still living with your parents and you've got a child, or you're just living with your parents at an age when 20 years ago you simply would not have been living with your parents. I don't know that you can say anymore that something's obviously gone a bit wrong. In fact, I suspect it would be accidentally offensive to say that something has gone a bit wrong. If you want to understand how and why it's happening, then I recommend Gary Stevenson, both his podcasts and his book, and indeed his YouTube channel and his book, and indeed his interview with me on Full Disclosure. He's absolutely brilliant at this, and he's in a bit... I have some familiarity with watching your predictions come true even when you don't want them to, but his predictions are based on a deep understanding of asset prices, and his warning that the mega rich are going to eat the middle class next will indeed be first manifested in the inability of middle class children, the children of middle class parents, to buy their own homes as they get older. Everything's getting bought by an ever shrinking minority of people at the very top of the pyramid. So I don't think I can sit here today and say anything interesting about the phenomenon of adults, even parents, aged between 18 and 34, living with their own parents living with their parents. I mean, frankly, having just admitted that I don't think I can say anything interesting about the whole subject, it's a miracle I've got to 12:16 unaided, isn't it? But I need some aid now. I need help from you. I just want to know what it's like. And And I don't know. We talk about tuition fees. And if you're my age, you presume that young people feel this burden really keenly. But actually, people who are going to university next year have never really been aware of a world in which they wouldn't have to undertake a huge amount of debt to go to university. So the conversation is not the same. I'm always reminded of the aunt of a junior doctor who rang us a couple of Christmases ago. It was a real penny drop moment for me for a whole bunch of reasons, because she was talking about her nephew being on the wards at Christmas when things get really, really messy and understaffed, low morale, bad behaviour by patients, much, much, much worse than it used to be. And she just said, well, he doesn't really see it like that because it's all he's ever known. This is only his second Christmas on duty in A&E. So this is all he's ever... And I suddenly thought, yeah, God, that's how they do the bad stuff, isn't it? Not with a bang, but with a whimper. They do it incrementally. They boil the frog. Things get gradually worse until you've got a whole generation of people who didn't even know that things used to be better. And I think that subject might be a bit like that. I can sit here and say to you, oh, it must be awful. Well, you'll go, well, actually, it's fine. But I can't shake the notion as a 52-year-old man that you'd rather not be living with your mum and dad if you're aged between 18 and 34. What do you reckon? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. I want to keep it... Well, I suppose we can go older than 34, but we can't go younger than 18 because that would be very much dog bites man territory rather than man bites dog. But what do you learn? What changes? Not just in your life, but how will society change, do you think, as more and more people aged between 18 and 34? And that upper limit, I think, is only going to get higher. Move back in with or never leave the family home. Hit the numbers now. You will get through. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need.
James O'Brien on LBC.
20 minutes after 12 is the time. I suppose I'm asking whether or not it's normal. So you are aged between 18 and 34, and a friend says to you, or you say to a friend, and I'm thinking perhaps from sort of the 24 upwards, 24 to 34, particularly interesting to me, or 22 to 34. So you've left, if you do tertiary education, if you go to college or university, that age group seems to me to be even more interesting. And you say to a friend, or a friend says to you, I'm living with my parents. Is that now normal? Or does it still have a stigma? 0345 6060 973. And of course I want to talk to parents as well. In fact, parents might be even more interesting than young people because you're juggling the two realities, the one in which it would have been a sign of failure when you were their age, and the one in which hopefully it isn't a sign of failure when they are their age. Teresa is in Sidcup, in that category, I think. Teresa, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. A little bit nervous, but I think I'll be okay.
It's only me. I'm sure you'll be okay. In fact, I'm certain of it.
Yeah, I've heard it before. So I've got two children. One's 28 and one's 30. My daughter went to uni in London. She lived away from home and came back. And my son went away after uni. He went away and lived in Greenwich for 6 years. But both are back with us at the moment for economic reasons. And we've recently looked at all kinds of amazing flat shares, and you can buy a quarter share in this. But for this quarter share, you have to sell your soul, your life, your cat, your budget, everything, and never go out and all the rest of it. And then it's only a quarter share, so the other half is the rent, and the rent will probably go up. So you're even buggered if you ever get any pay rises. So it's been better than I thought it would be, to be honest.
Having them in. What was it like when they told you? Did they sit you down and say, Mum, I've got some good news and some bad news?
Well, my daughter, I knew she was coming back away from uni, so, and then it was COVID and all sorts of things. Yeah. It was quite good that she was with us. Yeah. My son, poor soul, he lives away from home in Greenwich with some mates from university, and they did the whole, game nights and having a great time there. But he got to the age of 30, and he thought, I'd quite like to be a bit more civilised now. I'll try and went somewhere on my own. But he had no idea of how impossible that would be in London. And in the end, he got very depressed about it, and the landlord they were living with was going to put the rent up, even though there was masses of repairs that needed doing that he wasn't choosing to do. So they all forward and decided, right, that's it, quit, we're moving out, which was a very sensible thing for them to do, I think. And I said, well, come home, we can always think about it and all the rest of it. And we were thinking, oh my God. But actually, as I said to your presenter, I worked full time. I was a teacher. I didn't see much of my kids when they were little. In some ways now they're grown up and they're witty, and I don't have to wipe their bums.
That's a relief. Thank you for clarifying. I want to be sensitive on this, and I'm glad that you're seeing it more pluses than minuses. But when your son was 10, I presume you would have thought he'd own his own place by now, not just be able to afford to rent on his own.
Yeah. I mean, both of them. I just presume that by now they would have done what I did.
The world has changed, so that they've kept their end of the bargain. It's not as if they've had particular setbacks or hardships or anything like that. This is just the normal experience for 28 and 30-year-old children.
They've both got decent jobs.
Yeah.
It's more difficult because we live in London. I realise that. I come from the Midlands, incidentally, from your neck of the woods, from the West Midlands.
Whereabouts?
Kings Heath, Birmingham.
Okay. Yeah, I think nearish.
Yeah, nearish. I mean, we're black country people at heart.
That's the one.
Anyway, but what's interesting as well, as I can say from the point of view of some friends, kids I went to school with, one good friend of mine, all of her kids have moved out of London in order to be able to get somewhere to live. So she's got empty nest syndrome, whereas I've got full nest syndrome.
Gosh.
And another one has moved away, another one's moved out of London, Greater London.
And is it normal now? Is it when you say, oh, my two are both home, no one goes, oh, poor old Teresa?
No. I mean, what's normal is people have either their kids have moved away to the cheapest spot they can find in the country for somewhere to live, or they're living at home.
Well, good Lord. So it's a proper social change that goes not unnoticed, but goes largely unremarked because it's just happening very naturally and very incrementally.
Sorry.
The question I want to ask is are they ever going to leave?
Well, I think my husband's desperate for them to say, yes, I'm going now, Dad. All right, fine. But who knows?
Well, because the financial situation isn't going to change much, except for the money they can save while they're living with you.
No. I mean, they've both got good jobs. I mean, they're not extremely well-paid jobs, but they've got nice jobs. Definitely got nice jobs in London. And they like London, I have to say. So that's the reason why I don't really want to go too far.
No.
But the only way I can see in the long run of them leaving is that we will not want to be in a 3-storey house with a garden to look after. And we'll say something like, we're buying a flat, we're selling the place, we'll split the rest, and you can try and buy yourself something that way.
Good luck with that. And that will get them on the ladder. But again, it's people getting on the property ladder via somebody who's already on the property ladder. The idea of having to self-start, like I presume you and your husband did, to come from scratch, maybe a little bit of help from mum and dad, but generally most of our mums and dads weren't wealthy enough to give us help until they could cash in their own asset, which would be a house, either to downsize, as Teresa suggests, or sadly as a consequence of bereavement 26 minutes after 12. So it's no stigma then, I don't think. Or at least so far, there doesn't seem to be any. It's not as, I mean, the Resolution Foundation absolutely adamant that this is not a London problem, but I guess the cost of getting on the property ladder from scratch is going to be so much higher in London that it just becomes a more acute problem there than elsewhere. Tom's in Christchurch. Tom in Dorset, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi James. First time caller.
Welcome.
Been listening for a long time, so I'm really pleased to get on air.
Likewise, thank you, mate.
So my wife's 43, I'm 42. We've been living with my wife's parents now for 7 years. Due to circumstances, we're unable to rent privately or commercially and apply for a mortgage.
Right.
And
is that, if I may pry a little, is that because of your credit rating or something like that?
Yeah, so to put a little bit of backstory on that, my wife and I used to run a pub.
Okay.
And obviously with the pub came accommodation and everything.
Yes.
And when we decided to leave the pub, we did rent privately for a period of time, and, you know, we were comfortable. We both had good jobs.
Yeah.
And then about 2 years into that, I was diagnosed with cancer.
Okay.
So I couldn't work for a year. And our finances then obviously just plummeted, and credit rating went through the floor. And we had no option at that point but to move out and to basically lick our wounds, as say. And luckily, my wife's parents were in a situation where they took us in. And
you weren't expecting that, were you, when you left home?
No. It's not ideal, but luckily I'm still here to talk about it. So
I was about to say your priorities would have been slightly reordered anyway, but then you get caught in the pincer movement of the changing economic situation. So what is the likelihood of you? I mean, should you want to move out? What's the likelihood that while your parents are still alive, you ever could?
To be fair, we are probably in a situation now where we could rent again privately if we wanted to.
Good.
However, saying that, it's working really well.
So this is what I was hoping to hear. That's to both of you, actually, Teresa and you. describing circumstances that you may not have expected, but there's a lot more silver lining than cloud.
Yeah, absolutely. My father-in-law and I, we have very similar interests. We've got a workshop that we both tinker in at the weekends and do things. You know, it's like just having a bit of an older mate that you can get on with and have a bit of a laugh with. So, and we've got dogs as well, which they adore. So they don't want the dogs to move out with us either. So
So everybody's happy?
Yeah, everyone's happy, and luckily they got a big enough place where we're not under each other's feet either. You know, we've got our own living space and things like that. So we're quite fortunate in that respect.
Well, I guess that's two calls then where space has not been at a premium. If you can hear each other cough when you're in bed at night, that might be a slightly different proposition. But if you've got a little bit of space, I mean, it's the old-fashioned way of doing things. Actually, other cultures do it. When I spent a lot of time in Greece, the idea of anybody moving out of the family home until they were married was unheard of, and quite often even they'd stay there after they were married for a while they were getting their own place ready or getting their ducks in a row. It is quite an Anglo-Saxon thing, I think, to think that you fly the nest and never fly back again. But my reading of the situation today is that it's actually changing. It's changing under our noses. And the presumptions that you and I would have had when we were teenagers will not apply to teenagers tomorrow.
Absolutely not. And my parents spent some time in Portugal and Spain, and it's very common in Europe for people to stay in the family home.
Yes, and nice. Except for the way the economy is ordered and the question of actually who's going to end up owning everything. But I don't. This is what I wanted to happen. I didn't want it to be a conversation conducted in the way that it would have been 20 years ago, with a sort of little bit of a sly kind of, there you go. And partly because it's going to involve setbacks like Tom's health issues, and partly because, as Teresa highlighted, it's going to involve young people, or people aged 18 to 34, older in Tom's case, who are just, literally, that is just the way that the cookie has crumbled. There's nothing you could do about it. And that mantra of they've both got good jobs is part of this conversation, because that would once have been the reason why you weren't living at home with mum and dad or one or the other. It's 12:30 and Tim Humphrey is here now with your headline.
James O'Brien on LBC.
12:34 is the time. This is a little fruity from Kieran, but it really tickled my fancy during the news headlines. I also like people who try to knit the show together in a way that I very, very rarely manage to. I don't like the way we do three separate shows, three separate phone-ins. I like to string. You can't really go bi-topical. That doesn't quite work, because momentum is... very occasionally the opportunity presents itself. But I do prefer it to feel like a 3-hour programme rather than a 3 1-hour programmes. Or, I know you're busy, so you might only tune in for 20 minutes. And I have to remember then. I don't want to do one of those shows where we do the same 20 minutes on repeat. But I fully respect that if I was on at a different time of day, I'd have to think about doing something like that. But really, what I'm saying is you should be tuning in for the whole 3 hours every day. And if you're not, well, you're letting me down, you're letting LBC down, and most of all, you're letting yourself down. But Kieran has done the thing that I love. He's managed to knit it all together, albeit in a comical and mildly offensive, but in a funny way. He says, James, great programme as always. Thank you, Kieran. But you have missed the obvious solution to tie all of your subjects together today. Number 1, get the asylum seekers back into the backs of lorries to protect all the food stocks that are being stolen. Number 2, deport 0.07% of old people to Rwanda, which will greatly ease their arthritic pain. It's nothing better for arthritis than a nice, warm, dry environment. And finally, the deportation programme, will free up a shed load of housing for the younger generation. Just a thought. Love, Kieran. I think you're a genius. You're a genius. 12:36 is the time. One more word on Rwanda, if I may, before we get back to this conversation about parents living with parents or adults living with parents. Just think, and this works for both people. It works for people who are repulsed by this disgusting, ill-thought-through policy, and it works even for people who love anything that hurts foreigners, all right? I don't know that there's much of a middle ground on this specific policy between those two constituencies. So imagine if it worked a treat. Okay, imagine if, against all expectations, the Rwanda plan works brilliantly. It sees the regular deportation of thousands of people who've come here via irregular routes to Africa, to Rwanda, where they're all happy to stay. But it also simultaneously works as a deterrent. So not only are all the people deported there able to report back that actually it's really nice and they've got no complaints whatsoever, but at the same time, all the people who are thinking of coming here will not come here for fear of being sent to that place there that everybody sent to says is lovely. Right? This is the logic of Rishi Sunak's Rwanda scheme. But let us imagine for a moment that it works. Do you honestly believe, and remember, I'm talking both to people repulsed by the likes of Nigel Farage and people seduced by his weaselly charms, do you think he'd suddenly go quiet? If the Rwanda scheme worked a treat, do you think he'd stop complaining about foreign-born people, apart, of course, from his own family members, about foreign-born people living in this country, and, of course, very rich foreign-born people? Do you think he would? Do you think that Farage and his ilk would suddenly be relaxed about other nationalities living in this country? In the same way that after Brexit he stopped complaining about immigration. That's a joke, by the way. So regardless of whether the scheme works or not, spoiler alert, it won't, these people will still manage to inflate racist balloons and float them into Westminster. So just bear that in mind. I know that's quite a depressing thought, but I can't imagine anybody challenging it. Because, of course, if you're a Farage fan, then you need to ask yourself, if the Rwanda scheme works, will I stop being racist? To which we both know the answer is, of course you won't. Because it's a large part of who you are. The only way you can cling to the idea that you are of in any way of value as a human being is by buying into the idea that you are somehow superior to some people over there, born somewhere else. So even if the Rwanda scheme is the greatest success in the history of immigration legislation, do you really think that Farage and his ilk will stop inflating balloons of xenophobia and jingoism, racism, and forms of supremacism, as in this human is worth more than this human because of where they were born, and floating those bilious balloons right into the heart of the body politic? And of course the BBC will carry on giving them a season ticket. So that's just a thought. And that's finally, I like things on the programme we can all agree on, because racists aren't going to stop being racists. And we both know that, the people who aren't racist and the people who are. 12:39 is the time, 18 to 34. Go back to 1997, when Labour came to power. The most common living arrangement for someone in that age group was living as a couple with children. So cohabiting parents. That was the most common living arrangement, and no one else lived in the house. Most common living arrangement now for that cohort, you're living with your parents. I'm wondering what it's like from both sides of the generational divide. Hully is in Derby. Hully, what would you like to say?
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, Hully. Hello, Hully. You've never heard that before, have you?
I think that we're just going to get older. The state of the pricing of housing is absolutely ridiculous.
Yes.
And bills is absolutely ridiculous. I am on the outside looking in. I fortunately am in a very good situation where I don't live with my parents and I do live on my own with my daughter. Right. But I don't own my house.
Okay.
My mother owns the house and I just rent it off her.
Okay.
But I do know I do understand the situation, because I have friends that still live with parents and they tell me that they can't wait to move out and trying to look for houses, understanding how expensive it is to even rent, not own, rent. Rent is absolutely abysmal. Like people are going to be living with their parents longer, because who can afford to move out? It's virtually getting to the point of being impossible. And then you have the older generation that bought their house in the 50s, 60s, 70s for a Raspberry, telling us...
I've not heard that before. That's Raspberry as a synonym for pittance, is it?
Yeah, basically.
I've never heard that before.
You've got the older generation telling us, oh, well, stop buying avocado toast. I don't buy avocado toast. I don't buy iced coffees either.
No.
I probably buy one every two to 3 months.
Yes.
It would take me to save up for a deposit for a house on the wage that I'm on now. It would take me 18 years to save for a deposit.
Yeah. I mean, there's no getting past that point. And of course, it will then slip out of sight, because that means you're spending 18 years not enjoying yourself or not having a nice holiday.
And you only have one life. So I'm going to enjoy myself, and my friends are going to enjoy themselves. And instead of saving up for something that we don't know how the housing market's going to be, because at the moment it's right at the top. Is it going to come crashing down? Hopefully. Fingers crossed. Or is it just going to get higher and higher? We don't know. So
how does it break down? Because at some point, sorry to talk over you, but
okay.
Thank you. At some point, it becomes normal, and it hasn't quite yet in your peer group. So your friends still report unhappiness at their current situation, even though they can't see any light at the end of the tunnel. At some point, it stops being a tunnel, doesn't it? Or at least the light at the end of the tunnel goes out, and this is just the new normal.
It's just, unfortunately, and it's really sad to say that it is just the new normal now, that people aren't going to be buying houses because nobody can afford to buy houses. There's been a for sale sign on my street for a house for about 2 years. No one's bought it. Nobody. Yeah, for 2 years I've been looking at this for sale sign. Nobody's bought the house because nobody can afford to. And it's not just the younger generation; it's also the older generation.
Is it a starter home? Is it the sort of place you'd buy first?
It's actually a really nice house. I live on quite a nice street, and it's a really nice house. It's a quiet street.
Well, it should. I mean, the houses are. I'm just trying to work out why maybe it's on for too much, and they're not prepared to take less than what it's on for.
I don't know. I've not looked at the price of the house, but it's just a for sale sign that's just been there for 2 years, and it's like nobody can even afford to go on holidays. Nobody can afford to go on staycations anymore because they're wanting £800 to stay in Yorkshire. It's Yorkshire. Why am I paying £800?
You can't go on holiday to Yorkshire if you're in Derby. That's up the road. You could go to Cornwall or something like that. But why would you go? I love Yorkshire. I had some wonderful holidays in Filey. But why on earth would you want to go to Yorkshire from Derby?
I'm saying,
I know what you're saying.
Staycations used to be cheap, and now they're the same price as an all-inclusive holiday.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's like nobody's got money to buy anything anymore. Nobody's got money to buy gas and electric, food,
So your entire generation, and this is not a happy thought, but your entire generation is waiting for your parents. I mean, in terms of financial progress, you're waiting for an inheritance from a generation that could afford to buy property, whether for a raspberry or not.
Mm-hmm. That's what we're waiting for. And our parents might not even have any money saved to us. They might have used all their money. And
subsidise their retirement.
I'm not going to have money to give to my daughter. I'm not going to be, you've got a big inheritance coming. I've got no money to rub together. I ain't got 2p to rub together. I've got nothing. So it's going to be a never-ending thing where
and I guess the political
higher.
question is whether or not it actually animates your generation, whether they just accept it as the new normal, because the traditional political leverage has been trying to create a nation of homeowners, making sure that it's easier to buy houses. Building more houses is still a very popular political promise, not necessarily a very popular political delivery. But if you get more and more people who just see the cohabitation model as normal, then maybe the political calculus changes as well. I hadn't thought of that, Holly. Thank you. 12:45 is the time. I'll read this quickly from Alex. I'm 32, partner's 33. We both earn between us about 100 grand a year. Got a baby on the way. Certain we have no chance of owning. Our latest idea to bring everyone in the family's bills down is to all begin cohabiting. So we would move in with my mother and father and her mother. I never thought growing up that I'd even contemplate an idea like this, but it currently seems like the best and most logical course of action for all of us. That's what I mean about a new normal. That changes politics in ways that we can't even begin to work out yet, actually. The notion of aspiration, raised in my generation, if you didn't get on the property ladder by the time you were 30, you felt that you'd failed. And that wasn't a middle-class obsession any more than this is a London-based, Holly's in Derby, any more than this is a London-based problem. But if it changes, it changes. The things do not stay the same. The centre cannot hold. 12:46 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC.
12:49 is the time. Couple of questions for you, and one little tease, which I'm tempting fate here. I'm going to do a little teaser at 12:50 and then hand over to Sheila at 12:59. What are the odds on me being able to keep this in the back of my head for a whole 9 minutes and deliver the answer before I hand over to Sheila? She might even remind me. So the ageing process is what we're discussing. What age do you think mature adults now think of as being elderly? The age at which being elderly begins. 14,056, that's not the age. That's the number of participants in the German Ageing Survey. It's a long-running study, including people born from 1911 to 1974. You get loads of questions, and it changes, obviously, from year to year. What is the age at which people, the average or the majority, now considers old age to begin? What age do you think it is? It's quite interesting, that. I'm surprised by the answer. I won't tell you why until we get... I won't even tell you why then. And then the other thing I wanted to share with you, because this was a story that... I'm afraid I'm finding an awful lot of stories involving the Gaza Strip, Palestine, Israel, the West Bank. An awful lot of stories are getting halfway around the world, or indeed the whole way around the world, and then it turns out that the facts aren't quite as they were originally presented, and the real version of events doesn't get anything like the coverage that the original version of events got. So that's why I've chosen the Times of Israel from which to read this story, which will contain some familiar phrases and names. An independent review published yesterday of the beleaguered UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, that's UNRWA, said that Israel had yet to provide supporting evidence for its claims that a significant number of agency staff were members of terrorist organizations, and argued, this is the independent review, argued that UNRWA had robust policies in place to ensure staff neutrality. So I'm pretty sure we took calls, I definitely heard them on LBC, from people who were adamant that there was absolutely conclusive and irrefutable proof that the ranks of this refugee organisation were chock full of known Hamas extremists. But they haven't been able to provide any of that evidence, it would seem, to the independent review. The next paragraph almost writes itself. Israel rejected the findings, saying it only provided cosmetic fixes, reasserting its position that the agency was intertwined with Hamas and could not play a future role in Gaza. Of course, there's another aid agency that can't play a future role in Gaza after 7 of its workers got killed by Israeli soldiers. A prominent UN watchdog has also criticised the report as a whitewash. But the Times of Israel reporting the opening line, an independent review published Monday, said that Israel has yet to provide supporting evidence. So it doesn't mean that there isn't any evidence. It just means that they haven't shared any with the independent inquiry. And yet, when that story first broke, it was reported so widely and so unquestioningly as a matter of recorded fact. 12:53 is the time. Back to living at home. Unexpectedly, shall we say. Isaac's in Tower Hamlets. Isaac, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
It's nice to speak to you.
Likewise.
I just wanted to address the stigma thing that you were talking about. So I'm 24, and I don't live with my parents. I live with some friends in a flat share. But most of my friends from like my peer group from university still live at home with their parents, and in a way, I'm actually quite jealous of them. I would love to live at home. Just because I would save so much money.
So you need to be in London for work, and it's eating up so much of your income that you've barely got anything left to live on.
Yeah, I actually have friends like back home who make less than I do, but still have more disposable income.
Yeah, of course they do. So you wouldn't have any problem then with moving back in again, and your friends that are still living at home are perfectly happy with the arrangement.
I think there's some amount of. They want to have their own space and their own privacy, but I think generally they're quite happy with the amount of money that they're saving.
It's trade-offs, isn't it? Swings and roundabouts.
Yeah. But I mean, in a heartbeat, if I could move back home and be able to save that much money, I absolutely would.
I get that. 24 isn't necessarily the target age. I know you're between 18 and 34, but that idea of being compelled, it's a bit like me, actually. When I was your age, I couldn't afford not to work, whereas some people waiting to get into the industry that I'm in now could afford to hang around waiting for a break. But the possibility of getting into this industry while living in Kidderminster would have been absolutely zero. So I needed to both be, at least you're working in an industry you want to be in. 12:55 is the time. Just joining us because you don't like me but you love Sheila. The statistics here, the figures are really interesting. The idea, perish the thought, the idea that in 1997, if you were aged between 18 and 34, the most common living arrangement for you would be living in a couple with children. In a home that nobody else lived in. Now, it is living with your parents. Kareem is in Westminster. Kareem, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
So I'm 41 this year. My wife's 42. 10 years ago, we got married and we built a little annex at the bottom of the garden of my family home, which we then had a daughter who has so we've outgrown this place. And a year ago today, we moved back into the family home after 6 months of building works where we split the house into 2 flats. So it was getting a bit much. Mum and Dad didn't want to be going up and down much more, and we're spending a lot of time in one part of the house, really, relatively the sitting room or the kitchen. So they've now got a large 1-bedroom flat on the ground floor. I took a loan out and paid for the building works upstairs, so we've got like a split level 2-bed upstairs. We've still got the annex at the bottom of the garden, which my younger sister could always go to if she needs to, but she doesn't live in the country. We'll probably be a place for my mother-in-law to come and babysit, or eventually when everyone gets really old, it's like quite a good flat to have as a
it sounds like a nice arrangement. Was this always the plan, or have you cut?
No, not at all. But I mean, it's worked out great because I'm looking after Mum and Dad. They're looking after their granddaughter. They get to see her every day. It's worked out really, really well. If we did move out of London, it would probably be, I don't know, we spoke about maybe moving to Wales, to a part that you actually know quite well, I think, near Hay-on-Wye.
Yeah, but I do quite a bit. Yeah, no, I mean, just I don't know what it's like the rest of the year, but it's lovely when the book festival's on.
It's lovely all round, all year round. It's lovely.
No, I'm sure it is.
Even when it's raining.
Is it? I presume from your name that you're of Asian background, Kareem.
No, I'm not. I'm half Egyptian, half English.
Oh, okay. So in
Egypt, a lot of people tend to. It's very common for people to be at home until they get married, and then even then, you got blocks of flats where different members of the families are living in a different apartment. In the same block.
I mean, I was going to talk about the other cultures being not just comfortable with, but it actually would be odd to move out. Certainly, when I spent a lot of time in Greece, for a young woman especially, but also for a young man to not live at home while they were still single was eyebrow raising territory.
The only reason the only way they can generally leave the house is to get married. Like, but otherwise they're sort of anchored in. They're not even allowed.
Any downsides to it at all?
Not that I'm aware of just yet.
No.
But it's only been a year. But no,
well, keep in touch, eh? Let us know if anything changes. It is just coming up to 12:58. What do you think the age is at which people now consider old age to kick in? I told you I'd remember this. Do you know?
No.
Go have a guess. What is it for you?
What was it too old to care? I don't know.
Well, have a guess. Play the game, will you?
Sorry. I'm concentrating on my programme.
Oh, sorry. No, I didn't mean to distract you.
It's fine.
No,
okay, I'm going to say 78.
Oh, okay. No, you've gone high. It's 74, which I thought was quite old.
No.
No?
No. One of my best friends is 73. She's more lively than I am.
That's old age. I'd have said 70, I think.
No.
No?
No.
Well, you live and learn. It is gone one, nearly. If you missed any of today's show, it's not gone one. It's 12:59. It will have gone one by the time I finish this spiel. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player. Speak Up, the official LBC app, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Sawbrick, who, of course, will be with you again later in the day for the LBC hustings, featuring featuring the London mayoral candidates. But first of all, he's with you at 4. And before that, it's time for Sheila Fogarty.
elderly. You often hear in newspapers the elderly woman, 64, and you're like, what?
No, I get that. That's wrong.
It's only 7 years.
Well,
6 years.
74 now is the threshold. 74.
I still think that's too young.
All right.
James O'Brien on LBC.